Hi, PerspectaWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday, July 25th. A very pleasant air mass encompasses the mid-Atlantic region, much of the eastern U.S. this morning. Low temperatures in the lower 60s in many of the suburbs along the I-95 corridor region from D.C. to Philadelphia to New York City, for example. Looks like this part of the country will have a very nice drying out period over the next several days. Large high pressure is in control and will stay in control right into the early part of next week. Temperatures and humidity levels will be quite comfortable for the next couple of days. It'll tend to get more humid, a little bit hotter over the weekend. We'll approach the 90-degree mark again for highs by Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday of next week in the I-95 corridor region, but certainly nothing like the heat wave of last weekend. And again, I think we'll look back on last Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the Mid-Atlantic region, in the Midwest, perhaps Northeast U.S., as well as probably the hottest stretch of the summer that we will experience. On the tropical scene, nothing going on right now in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Atlantic Basin. The Gulf of Mexico is quiet. There was a tropical depression earlier this week off Florida. That has dissipated. There was a little bit of a wave over the Gulf of Mexico yesterday. That has dissipated. Actually quite unusually quiet for this late in the month of July. Certainly the Atlantic Basin tropical season ramps up in August, and especially September. But still, nonetheless, this is a look all the way around the world, and only a couple of systems here aren't even named tropical systems at this time, just weak tropical waves here, one in the far eastern Pacific and one in the far western Pacific Ocean. Nothing at all in the Atlantic Basin. Again, there was a little bit of a wave in the Gulf of Mexico that dissipated overnight. There was a tropical depression off of Florida earlier in the week, and that too has fallen apart. So again, quite a quiet look, not only in the Atlantic Basin but around the world for late July in terms of tropical activity. Well, in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies and tropical activity, a couple of interesting points to point out. First of all, Gulf of Mexico still has a little bit of cooler than normal conditions over the northern part of the Gulf. That is due to the upwelling that occurred with Tropical Storm Barry that became briefly a hurricane earlier in the month of July. Notice large area of above normal temperatures along the Atlantic seaboard into a part of the tropical Atlantic. This region right here, quite an impressive warm blob of water here. But notice off the African coast and all the way down into the Caribbean Sea area at or below normal sea surface temperatures. And this is a inhibiting factor to the formation of tropical activity, at least in that part of the Atlantic. Haven't had really an African wave that pushes from the west of the from the east to the west off the African coast. We really haven't had anything that has formed out here so far this tropical season. And again, this is one of the reasons why normal to below normal temperatures in that particular zone from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean Sea. Well, certainly those sea surface temperatures off of the west coast of Africa all the way into the Caribbean are an inhibiting factor for tropical storm formation. Another big factor is a lot of dry air over the tropical part of the Atlantic Ocean. This particular map comes from a website from the University of Wisconsin. Just Google CIMSS and you'll find these particular types of maps, as well as the previous one that showed, the first map we showed that showed the lack of activity around the world. This represents dry air that comes off the Sahara Desert in Africa in orange and yellow, and just notice how widespread it is. Here, first of all, here we are, the west coast of Africa right here, and all of this represents some dry air all the way into the Caribbean Sea and much of the tropical part of the Atlantic Ocean. Again, it typically, this time of the year, you have trade winds set up that the air blows from the east to the west off the coast of Africa into the eastern part of the Atlantic, and if it comes from the Sahara Desert, very well could be dry air, and that's what we're showing right here with this color scheme of yellows and reds And that is also an inhibiting factor for tropical storm formation. Again, we have not had an African type wave so far this tropical season. Again, it's still rather early, but oftentimes we have had an African wave type of system by this time of the tropical season. So again, continuation of a lot of dry air off the Sahara Desert over the Atlantic Ocean. Well, let's take a quick look back at the continental U.S. last night's 6Z GFS model run, and the main weather feature in the eastern third of the nation is this tremendous high pressure system now centered over the Midwest, and it really stays in control in much of the eastern U.S., not only through the weekend but into the early part of next week. It'll tend to shift off the East Coast over the upcoming weekend. That will allow a little bit warmer air, a little bit more humid air, certainly by the second half of the upcoming weekend in the eastern states, but nothing like the heat wave that we experienced last weekend. And let's just move forward here and see how this continues to dominate for much of the next several days. Here we go. Friday morning, one piece of it starts to shift off the coast, but it tends to reform inland here, and that's a good thing for the eastern part of the nation, where it's very wet in terms of soil moisture. Of course, we have very well saturated grounds throughout much of the eastern third of the nation, and this drying period is really a blessing. We haven't had an extended period of drying weather in the east in a long time, and this will do wonders to relieve the potential of flash flooding and that sort of thing. Here we are now into Sunday morning, still high pressure inland a little bit. Piece of it shifted off the coast, but then kind of reformed over the interior part of the eastern U.S., and we'll just go into Monday morning right here. Continuation of high pressure in the eastern U.S., so an extended period of drying weather conditions. Very pleasant temperatures and humidity in the east over the next few days. It does get warmer, more humid by the latter part of the weekend into the early part of next week. We'll be pushing 90, but can't complain because generally rain-free conditions in the east for the next several days, and pretty much quiet on the tropical scene as well. That's it for now. For PerspectaWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.